I wanted to talk to you about Panpuss the cat, because I'll be reading from this today. That's him on the cover there, Bedtime Storybook. It's a bit inappropriately timed. The Adventure of Panpuss the cat is what I'm going to be reading. But first, I wanted to show you this wonderful picture of him drawn by a friend of mine, Ria Chandler, who is available for commissions on Facebook. And she did that wonderful painting of him, and other pictures of Panpuss are there. That's him being on the desk, on the vine leaves that I brought in, guarding the Christmas presents and sleeping on the bed. Just so you get an idea of what this is about. Panpuss lived between 1995 and November 2011. Sadly, he passed. But he is legendary and will never be forgotten by everyone who met him during that time. This story is about when Panpuss went missing for 3 weeks, and I made up a little story of what I thought he'd been up to during that time, although he'd probably just been living with some old lady, or he was perfectly well fed when he came home anyway. Also, I've recently dyed my hair black at the ends because Chris used to call me the girl with the Panpuss hair, all different colours, like him. So, here we go. The Adventures of Panpuss the cat. Panpuss stood in the porch of a house where his people lived. He sat down and opened his mouth slightly to taste the air and see what sort of a night it was going to be. It did not smell like the usual sort of night, which consisted mainly of defending his territory and other important business. This night smelt like a great big adventure. He looked back briefly at the window where his person stood watching, waiting to see which way he would venture off, and hoped for a moment that they would not worry too much, as he had a feeling he would not be back until well into tomorrow this time. If only they would learn at least the basics of cat language, they wouldn't have to worry about him so much. It wasn't really so much to ask, after all. He had learnt the basics of human, and that was much more complicated. He'd even managed a basic grasp of the concept they knew as time. But they couldn't even understand his simple request for a good firm brushing, or a big chunk of fish, let alone know when he was off on a big adventure. He gave a big sigh, resigning himself to his people's stupidity, and then arched his back in a major spinal stretch. Now, which way was this particular adventure blowing from? He opened his mouth and sniffed and tasted again. Definitely the north. After a quick look about to check for the presence of humans and dogs, he ran around the side of the flats to the east, as he could not go directly north because of the railway, keeping his belly low to the ground and running alongside the shrubs, in case he needed to take cover quickly. Soon he had covered the ground between the flats and the washing yard, and at a run he leapt up the fence that bordered the yard. Precision walking along the top of the fence, 2 legs on the fence post and 2 on the fence top, making walking a tricky and somewhat ungainly experience. Not aided by the fact that Panpuss had lost his tail in a car accident some years previously, and his balance had never been quite all it should be since. But he was a determined cat and recovered well. Within a couple of minutes he had reached the wall at the far side of the yard, and from there it was an easy stroll to the factory roofs. Over in the western sky there was still a little orangey red light left, he noticed, as he sat down for a quick wash and survey of his territory. But here in the east, amongst the factory roofs, where the adventure smelt strongest, all was in blackness. He walked along the roof to the darkest part and sat staring into the blackness, allowing his eyes to adjust. He did not usually come this way, but he couldn't resist the call of the something in the air tonight. Now he could see a little better. He realised he would have to make a jump across the small gap to the factory roof. It was only a small gap and did not require a running start, or so he thought. He sprung, aiming his whole body at the place he wanted to land on the other side. but immediately realised something was wrong. He had misjudged the distance and wasn't going to make it. He stretched his spine out as long as he could, but to no avail. He could feel himself starting to lose height. Panpuss extended his claws and reached desperately for the elusive roof ahead, and now alarmingly above him, but knew it was no use. He was falling, no two ways about it. He arched his back, looking beneath him to see where he was going to land, as a canvassy type of material rushed up towards him. He felt his claws rip the fabric and sort of tangle up in it, but the falling didn't stop. Panpuss didn't have time to be perplexed, as his head hit something cold and hard, and "Oops!" was his last thought as he lost consciousness. When Panpuss woke up, his first thought was that his head hurt, but that was soon replaced by another, more frightening thought. He could feel a kind of rumbling, rolling sensation that he definitely knew from somewhere. The ground he was laying on was moving somehow, and then he remembered. It was the feeling of being taken somewhere in the car with his people, usually to the vet. Above him, through the tangle of canvas he was laying in, he could see the sunlight. He shook himself out of the material and stood up with a start. How long had he been asleep? And more to the point, where was he? He took a deep sniff of air, and behind the smell of cars there was the smell of home, but it was very faint and getting fainter. Just then the van slowed to a stop in the road. It was still thrumming along but not moving. Without another thought, Panpuss jumped over the side and ran for the first green patch of grass he could see. Although he felt confused being so far away from all the smells of home that was so familiar to him, he felt very reassured by the sensation of spongy, slightly damp grass beneath his paws and the comforting greenness of its smell. Panpuss saw some people walking along the path towards him and scooted for the cover of a nearby bush. He sat down under the dense foliage of the bush for a little while to collect himself. It was a perfect kind of bush. The leaves fell low to the ground in places, and Panpuss could see out from between them, but he was fairly sure that no one could see him. Feet walked past on the path just a few feet away, only a small patch of grass between them, and Panpuss remained unseen. Better still, dogs on leads strained to get to him but were dragged on past by their owners, who had no inclination to stop and investigate a random bush. Panpuss relaxed and had a little wash, which always helped with the thinking process. The soil under the bush was soft and peaty, with a fine covering of dead leaves, and smelt faintly of mice. Panpuss felt sleepy and decided to have a little nap. Soon it would be night, at least it felt like that time of day. It would be much easier to try and smell the way home when there weren't so many cars and people about. Panpuss curled up into a ball and slept, dreaming of catching passing mice. Panpuss catnapped the afternoon and early evening away, opening his eyes occasionally to check everything was as it should be, and no new dangers lurked. Finally it was fully dark, and the traffic had thinned to the occasional car and no lorries. People were few and far between on the path. Panpuss stood up, letting the low-hanging branches of the bush gently scratch along his spine, and did a little bit of stretching before sitting again, but a more fully alert sit this time. Now for some serious sniffing. He turned to face each direction, opening his mouth a little so he could taste the smells as well as sniff them. At each turn he smelt something different. From one direction came an alluring smell of beef and onions, but it also smelled strongly of lots of people. Although Panpuss was quite hungry by now, he was not going to risk going that way. From another direction came a horrid mix of smoke and chemical-type smells. He was definitely not going to risk going that way. The third way smelt of grass and trees and pine, which Panpuss, being a Norwegian forest cat, loved. That direction had possibilities, but did not smell of home. The final direction was the right one. There was a smell of ozone and salt and slightly rotten seaweed, and maybe just a few fishy smells. Also, when Panpuss pointed his ears in that direction, he thought he could just hear the squawk of a seagull. That was where home was. Panpuss peered out from under the bush in that direction. Mostly the road seemed to run that way, but Panpuss did not want to walk along the open road. He had had previous trouble with cars. Just to the right of the road, towards the direction that smelt of trees and plants, was a fenced-off area that seemed quiet and empty of people. Panpuss could go through there, keeping the road in sight and hearing, but keeping away from traffic and people. He made a dart for the nearest bit of fence and squeezed through. His whiskers had to bend to get through, but he knew from squeezing through the banisters at home that it was most definitely wide enough. Once inside the park, Panpuss relaxed a little. There were no people or cars or dogs. There were birds and ducks and squirrels, but they all gave Panpuss a wide berth, as they did not want to be his dinner. But something had to be. His tummy was fully rumbling now, and it really was the next most important item on his agenda. But it was Panpuss's lucky night, for he quickly came across the smell trail of yummy cooked chicken. The trail ended at a red and white stripy grease-stained box. Panpuss stuck his nose inside and pulled out a lump of chicken, a mixture of semi-gnawed meat and bones. Panpuss had a quick look round to make sure it was definitely safe, and then settled down to an intensive snack of his favourite type of food. To begin with, he ate standing up, then moved to a kind of ready-to-spring squat, then finally sat down fully. Panpuss stripped the chicken down to a small pile of bare bones, and then stuck his muzzle back in the red and white box. To his great delight, there was a gnawed chicken leg in there too. He made relatively short work of that, then ate the few chips that were also in the box. He didn't mind chips, especially chicken-flavoured ones like these, but preferred them from his people when he had sat giving them the big eyes and managed to beg one or two off their plates. A little wave of nostalgia for home came over him as he sat and washed, or rather moved the oily chicken juices from his mouth to all over his head and ears. Panpuss decided it was time to head off. He knew that if he just curled up and slept, like his full tummy was suggesting, he would not make any kind of headway under the cover of the night, and he had to at least make a start for home. He trotted purposefully southwards through the park, ignoring all the scuttling sounds that would normally have had him off investigating. Excuse me. After about 15 minutes, he came to some more railings that indicated this was as far as he could travel south within the safety of the park. Panpuss squeezed out through the fence onto a deserted pathway. Just ahead of him was a big group of very similar-looking houses. They may have looked similar, but they all had different smells coming off of them. There were no cars or people around, and the moon was high in the sky, suggesting it was quite late, so Panpuss decided to risk going through the houses and staying on track for home. It took him quite a long time to get across to the other side of the houses, though he did make a few stops, a couple of times to drink rainwater from pots and garden ornaments, and once to dig a hole in some nicely soft, freshly turned soil that had obviously been left there thoughtfully as a toilet for cats. At one point he saw a lone woman in the distance putting down handfuls of something on walls as she passed. When Panpuss went to investigate, he found to his great delight that she had provided him with a late supper in the form of a handful of cat biscuits. After another quick wash, mainly just face and ears, but obligatory after even a minor snack, Panpuss headed on. The houses came to an abrupt end at a dry stone wall, about the same height as a person. The wall directly blocked the direction Panpuss wanted to go, but he was a cat, so he clambered swiftly up it. On the other side he could see what looked like huge mown fields, dotted with slabs of stone and vases of flowers. There were no people or cars about, so he jumped down. He spent most of the rest of the night crossing this huge area, stopping briefly around dawn for a mouse snack that he caught by one of the stone box arrangements. Just after dawn, Panpuss heard the clanging of gates being opened and realised that the noise of cars and people had started up again. He looked around and spotted a large flower and shrub area away from the paths. He wandered around in it for a little while until he found a nice fulsome bush, then curled up hidden underneath it to have a good long sleep. He awoke a couple of times during the day, disturbed by various not too close noises, traffic and a lawnmower. but used the between nap time to have a good wash and grooming session and a bit of a stretch before going back to sleep again. He came awake more fully when he heard the distant clang of the gates being closed and every sign of night beginning to fall. After a good stretching session, he ventured out cautiously from under his bush, keeping his belly low to the ground until he was sure it was safe. Time for a mouse hunt. Several mice later, all eaten in his specific order, tails bitten off and left behind, Panpuss was ready to head off again. He sniffed the air to check his direction. The smell of the sea was definitely getting stronger. Panpuss came to the southern wall that edged the graveyard fairly early in the evening. Ahead of him were some hedged country lanes, then thick woodland as far as he could see or smell. He spent the next couple of days heading south through the woods, happily not seeing any people or cars, and only hearing them in the remote distance. Mice, voles, shrews were abundant in the woods, and there were plenty of shallow streams and puddles to drink from. Panpuss napped and groomed when he needed to and travelled by both day and night. He loved the woods, especially the smell of pine trees and the soft leaf mulch under paw. Finally the woods started to thin out, and through the trees Panpuss could see rolling green chalk hills. The smell of the sea and the sound of seagulls was much stronger and louder now. He could feel that he was nearly home. Panpuss travelled across the green chalk hills, through the long grass, peppered with sheep droppings and scurrying rodents. There was no shortage of snacks round here. He came to a large pond and stopped for a much-needed drink. Down the other side of the hill he could see a busy road. He decided to curl up under a bush for a sleep and wait for nightfall. A long while later, when the night was very dark and the traffic had gone quiet, and the road was empty most of the time, Panpuss crept out towards it. He picked his moment and ran across super fast, bounding into the long grass on the other side. He clambered up a fence and into a vegetable patch. He knew this place. He was in the allotments near his home, where he sometimes came for a bit of mousing when he felt the urge. He got his bearings and headed for his home. Then he saw it and was happy to note the kitchen window was open. He was even happier to notice that the wonderful smell of roasting chicken was pouring out of the window. His people were cooking chicken. Perhaps they did know he was almost home after all. He started to purr, a big rumbling sound that started deep in his belly and was seemingly unstoppable. Panpuss ran up to the house and, barely pausing to gauge the gap, jumped in through the kitchen window and padded confidently into the living room. His people jumped up and ran over to him, crying, "Panpuss, you're home! Where have you been?" And picking him up and cuddling him. They were obviously very pleased to see him. Later, after everyone had settled down and had a meal of roast chicken and was sitting comfortably full, Panpuss stretched luxuriously on the carpet in front of the television, where he could be most prominently visible. His people said to each other, "I expect he's been stuck in someone's shed all week or something." "No, he looks far too well fed for that. I reckon he's been living with some little old lady who's just been feeding him fish all the time and just finally missed us." Panpuss thought to himself, "They'll never know the adventure I've been on." He stretched and fell asleep, purring contentedly. Classic Panpuss. Hope you enjoyed that.